So, a harbour. Let's consider a harbour. It can look calm. It can look quiet. But ships are not well secured because conditions are always calm and quiet. They are secured because conditions change, and we know that. The strength of a ship or a boat's safety is not so much a concern for when the water is still, but when the wind and when the tide take it from what it is moored to. A loose mooring is exposed only when the pressure comes upon the ship. Now, Paul assumes pressure is already present in Crete. That's why an elder must be a man, he says here, who holds fast the faithful word. In Crete, false teachers were already ruining households. But Paul does not respond by telling Titus to appoint persuasive men or innovative thinkers. He tells him to appoint men who will hold firmly to the word they were taught. When pressure comes, the elder who loosens his grip on the word will drift, and others will drift with him. So he must be rock solid. He must be able to discern errors, stand against all that which is corrupt and ruins what Paul says, the faithful and trustworthy word. And he has to help the church community stay true to that word. What is this word? It is the gospel of Jesus Christ as taught by the Apostle Paul. But don't just stop there. It also captures all the practical realities of how the gospel applies to our lives. Don't let that fall away from you. Now, in the sermon last week, we looked at the qualifications Paul has laid down to Titus on who an elder should be. And we saw there that the proving ground of an elder was his family life. It is the proving ground because he's a manager. He is a steward of his household. And Paul's reasoning is straightforward. If a man cannot demonstrate faithful oversight of his own household, how will he exercise faithful oversight of God's household, the church? Now, it does not mean that an elder is expected to be faultless, but that there are no legitimate charges that can be laid against him in the areas Paul specifies here. We also noted that his character is to be above reproach. Though not expected to be faultless here either, nevertheless, he needs to have a character that is what the scriptures say here is blameless. In other words, while accusations may come, there must be nothing that rightly sticks. His character must be such that it withstands scrutiny because he serves as God's steward, God's manager among God's people. The elder's role expressed here in Titus, as I mentioned before, is God's steward, God's manager. And he is to hold to that faithful word. I'll emphasize again, this is the apostolic word handed down by Paul concerning Jesus Christ. What he has done through his death and his resurrection, and all that necessarily flows from those acts for the life of God's people. Paul describes this word as faithful or believing. The Greek word pistos. It's the same term we saw earlier in the chapter with reference to an elder's children. In both cases, the emphasis is not on believing, but on reliability that can be seen. In verse 6, the elder's children are described as faithful in the sense that their lives do not contradict God's good order of the household that is led by the father. Here in verse 9, the word itself is faithful because it corresponds truthfully to what God has done in Jesus Christ. It is faithful not because it proclaims the events of the cross and the resurrection, but because it rightly interprets those events. This is very important. From many other people's perspective outside, they just think Christ was an insurrectionist and died for that insurrection. Those events have to be rightly interpreted in what they accomplish, in what they reveal about God, in what they require of his people. It is a word that does not shift because both the events it proclaims and the meaning God has attached to them do not shift. An elder, therefore, has to be able to point these realities out to the people. As it says here in this passage, he is to exhort in sound teaching, so proactively be able to instruct in the truth, but he also has to refute or reprove those who contradict. Now, this is where it becomes pretty challenging for an elder. This world no longer accepts that you can argue for truth, nor accuse someone of falsehood. That's no longer tolerable. It's not acceptable to the world, neither on psychological nor philosophical grounds. Psychologically, we really have been brainwashed into the self-esteem dogma. You need to understand that this has derived from a particular perspective about mankind. That at his core, man at his core is good, fundamentally good. If that is true, then he is truly worthy of his own love and should deny that he is anyway unworthy. The self-esteem psychology is profoundly unhelpful, since theologically, and I hope you are theologically cluey on this, you would realise that we are not worthy before God. This is why we have such a thing as grace and mercy. Grace being divine favour. In spite of our unworthiness, God gives us what we don't deserve. And mercy being divine restraint. Due to our unworthiness, God is not giving to us what we do deserve. Now, on philosophical grounds, we are being told that your truth is your private truth, and no one has the right to impose their truth on anyone else. There is no universal truth, they say. And if that is so, then people can believe what they like. But of course, how does that work when a person's truth says that they can fly, for example? Now, that's getting into the absurd, but what I'll show you soon, that absurdity is happening in our world. But how does that work? You know, when they jump off a tall building and put their flight, their truth, to the test. I wouldn't like to see the outcome of that. This is how nonsensical the world has become. I even heard this week a senator in the United States question a doctor with this. Here's the question. Can men get pregnant? I don't know how you'd answer that. But this doctor, she consistently refused to acknowledge the reality that biological men cannot get pregnant. She refused to acknowledge that. Philosophy dictated her position, not reality. Now, these and many other factors are the forces at work which would look down on an elder who would reprove someone for contradicting the true message of Christ. So yes, an elder must do both. Positively, he must teach and inform. Negatively, he must reprove those who contradict. Now, this is going to take both conviction and courage. Conviction To be the man of God requires putting God's word of truth first. That's the conviction. And courage, the courage to be able to brush aside the censure of those who do not understand the value and importance of this faithful word of truth. Those two things need to be happening for an elder to be true and faithful in that respect. Now, there are different ways people suggest in dealing with opposition to sound teaching. Some would argue that confrontation is unnecessary and that it is better to work with shared values and avoid drawing clear lines. You know, a well-known example comes from Australian politics. When John Howard brought Malcolm Turnbull into the cabinet, many noted at a later time that Turnbull's progressive views would eventually reshape the direction of the Liberal Party, moving the party to the left of politics. And we all know what's history here, don't we? What eventually happened was to upend forever the truth that marriage was between a man and a woman. So rather than confronting those differences which were becoming evident at the time, the approach that was taken was accommodation, hoping that unity could be preserved without addressing the underlying convictions. And over time, that accommodation did not restrain those views. It normalised them. The party's position on marriage eventually shifted, and what had once been treated as settled was reopened and overturned. That is Paul's concern in Crete. The false teachers are not silent and they are not harmless. They may not outrightly deny the events of Jesus' death and resurrection. They can affirm that, but they reshape what those events mean. And when that happens, as Paul says here, whole households are ruined. He says in verse 10, "For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting," or you could put there, ruining whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of dishonest gain. If they are left unchallenged, they reshape how the truth is understood. Compromising with people who do not stand with you on your beliefs and values turns out to be a fool's errand. The issues in Crete are very similar to those in Ephesus that we find with the pastoral epistles to Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 4, "But the Spirit explicitly says that in later times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons by the hypocrisy of liars who have been seared in their own conscience." Pay attention to the words in red, because that's going to come through in Titus. "Who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God created to be shared in with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good." As we saw before, very good. "And nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and by prayer." These false teachers have brought Greek dualism into the gospel. Some foods, they say, are impure. Marriage, they say, is unclean. They base these thoughts on the philosophy of the time, of dualism. Dualism. That philosophy that divides the world into the spiritual and the physical, the upper story, the lower story. It calls the spiritual part good, but the material part or the physical part is inherently bad or evil. Plato taught that the human soul, the spiritual side of the human, was entrapped in this body. and was only free at the death of the body. Now, you follow this through. This image here shows some aspects of life that dualism touches. And notably, it divides life into the sacred, the upper story, and the secular, the lower story. Now, let me give you an example of how this thrashes out. There were some in Corinth who were disregarding the marriage relationship in favour of prayer. Prayer is good, of course, but prayer for them replaced sexual relations in marriage, designating such practice as the base actions of the material body. Prayer in their minds was of the highest good, was spiritual and the highest good. And they reasoned that a relationship with God required denying the body and focusing on the spiritual, especially prayer. Look what Paul says about it here. He says, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So here Paul cuts through the dualistic nonsense to promote married life in the body as good. So we see specifically that those in Crete have similar issues to those in Ephesus and even in Corinth. Let's go back to Titus, where he says, not paying attention to Jewish myths and the commandments of men who turn away from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but both their mind and their conscience are defiled. Their consciences are triggered by the thought that things, physical or material, are impure, like marriage, like certain foods. These issues also evident in Ephesus, 2 Timothy. Their word will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have gone astray from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already taken place. And they upset, again, the same word, or ruin the faith of some. The claim of these false teachers who say that the resurrection has already taken place can only be understood as a spiritual resurrection. This is actually true from the point of view that we as believers have been raised spiritually and we're seated with Christ in the heavenly places. So that point is true. However, they are emphasizing this to deny a bodily resurrection. You see, if the body is evil and the spirit or spiritual is good, then they will shun a literal body or a material resurrection. They would see that as again possessing an impure or unclean thing. Now, question, how has this impacted the church over history? Well, let me share one way where it has truly touched a core issue. And we know that as infant baptism. Now, this is a challenge for you, right? Why is it we find evidence for the practice of infant baptism in the church only from around the 3rd century AD, right? Think about these things that we've been talking about. I would argue that Platonic dualism is what has brought the church into this practice. It's not a biblical practice. That's a practice that has crept in through Greek philosophy, dualistic philosophy. Now do the maths. If matter, material existence, is unclean, impure, evil in itself, then what happens to the infant that dies in birth or dies very young before they can comprehend the gospel? See, if they're not born pure, would they not be destined to hell? Now, why did the church baptise infants? Well, we can see here firstly, they understood rightly that baptism was associated with the forgiveness of sins, that is, salvation. They understood that rightly. Secondly, they believed that the child needed salvation because they were born impure. That is, they're made of matter, material existence. I think this argument is inference to the best explanation for the practice of infant baptism, since you cannot find it, nor is it taught in the New Testament. And so Paul criticises this notion of what God has created is impure. He says, to the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled in their minds, unbelieving, not believing God, nothing is pure, but both their mind and their conscience are defiled. The word says that God created all things good. They refuse to believe that. God created food. God created marriage. How, pray tell, are these things impure if he created all things good? Now, what you do in the body may be evil. That's another question. And we're not talking about what you do in the body. It's about what these dualists believe you are as a body. So if you are resting on your infant baptism, I have to be frank and say that it's not a valid baptism. It can't be. In the New Testament, baptism is volitional. Have you noticed that? The candidate for baptism, not the parents or a guardian, make the choice to follow Jesus. They make that choice. Now, of course, I was baptised as a baby according with church tradition, but I chose to be baptised when I heard the gospel and accepted Jesus. But as we come back to Titus, he's going to have a difficult time of this. Here in Crete, Paul says, they don't have a good reputation as a people. They're not the greatest kinds of people that you're going to come across. He says in verse 12, he says, one of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars. Remember that thing I put up in red? Put red letters there. Liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. For this reason, reprove them severely so they may be found sound in the faith. Now, that's a quote from one of the prophets themselves. And the early church fathers say it's the prophet Epimenides of Crete in the 5th century BC. Now, other writers have also made similar statements about Cretans. Cicero, Roman historian, wrote that Cretans regarded highway robbery as an honourable thing. So it's interesting, isn't it, that in our world, negative generalisations or stereotyping of people, it's not welcome, is it, in our world? But the question, I think, remains is whether such generalisations are true or not. I recall over my lifespan, I've heard it said, rightly or wrongly, that the French are arrogant. I don't know, you might have heard that. Hope there's no French here. Jews are stingy. Now, I've heard that over my lifetime. And of course we know that not every single person in a particular nation is the same. But there are generalisations, characterisations that may stand accurate. Like as an example, and it's not popular to say this, but it's true to say men are stronger than women. Because it's not popular, but it is true. But the truth is that in general, they are stronger. So why is it wrong to say that men are generally stronger than women? Now, of course, we know it's not 100% true. Exceptions exist. I know there's probably plenty of women stronger than me. But that's not the point, is it? They're generalizations, and they can be true statements. And no one truly believes that stereotyping applies absolutely to everyone. Now, the same is true here in what Paul writes, with this characterization regarding Cretans to whom Titus is to minister. If the Cretans have a tendency towards rebelliousness and deception, Paul wants to remind Titus of the challenge that's going to be before him. It ain't going to be easy with these people. But at the same time, he wants to remind the Cretan churches as they read this letter of their own propensity towards these negative traits, as testified by one of their own prophets. Now, Paul points out that a Cretan had already said this about Cretans. And of course, that puts the hearers in a difficult situation. If they accept what the prophet said, then they have to accept the charge. But if they reject it, they then discredit one of their own prophets and confirm the very problem the charge describes. The point is, Titus must not tolerate this situation. Paul says here, the testimony of their prophet is true. For this reason, reprove them severely so they may be sound in the faith, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. And of course, reprove here means to expose the wrong, bring it out into the open, lay out this clear indictment against their behaviour. That's what reprove means. And of course, what's the aim? The aim is not to humiliate them, but that they might be sound in the faith. Now, this is going to take a lot of courage for Titus to do and for every prospective elder. Now, I recall as I wear gloves to prepare communion, the irony of wearing gloves in handling food and stuff is that the gloves are meant to keep the food clean. Yet, the person wearing them can still contaminate the food by touching cupboard handles, picking up knives, moving utensils around, opening up the fridge and the garbage lids. I mean, the food itself, perfectly good, okay? But because the person handling it or touching it, touching other items, it becomes unclean. The food itself is perfectly good, but by others it can become unclean. And Paul points to this same irony in the false teachers. They're obsessing over certain parts of God's creation, declaring them impure, unclean. But it is not the creation that is the problem. Their own minds, you see, their consciences are defiled. And because of that, everything they touch, handle, or teach is corrupted. So let's look at these last two verses. To the pure, Paul says, all things are pure. But to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But both their mind and their conscience are defiled. False teachers are preoccupied with purity. They treat certain parts of God's creation as unclean, as in certain foods, as in marriage. And of course, they've swallowed the pill of dualism. This philosophy is a creation of man and his fallen thinking. And these false teachers take their own ideas about what is unclean and they start applying it to everyday life. Like, think of this, or them, the false teachers, like a computer with a corrupted memory. Think of it like this. If the memory is faulty, you cannot trust anything that the computer produces. Like every calculation, every output is affected by the corruption. Or just imagine two streams running down a hill. One is pure water, the others dirty or filthy. And when they meet at the bottom, cannot expect the water to be clean. The impurity of one stream contaminates the whole. Now, Paul's point is the same. The problem is not the created things themselves. Food, marriage, everyday life, they are all good. All good. The problem is the defiled conscience. In the way they think about these things, their conscience is defiled. And when that conscience is corrupted, defiled, everything they touch or teach becomes corrupted and defiled. It's hard to know what the conscience really is and how it works. But a conscience is formed by the things you are taught and believe. That's how it's formed. Your conscience becomes wired in a certain way, and everything there becomes processed or filtered through the mind, and it is processed as either good or evil. Your conscience then will either acquit you or condemn you. It's formed by what you were taught and what you believe. Now, in Corinth, new believers had their consciences wired to believe that idols represented gods. In their pre-Christian state, they were very aware that there are other gods. Food offered to idols was sold in the local supermarkets where people could buy the meat. And questions arose about this meat that was offered to idols, since they're concerned about religious purity. And what Paul says to them, he says, therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no God but one. However, not all men have this knowledge, but some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it was sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. You see, the conscience had been wired to accept the existence of gods, other than, of course, the true God, and their consciences were condemning them for eating the meat that was sacrificed to idols. They hadn't been able to shun off that defilement and corruption. Now, I think the last verse truly links what the conscience accepts and believes with how one lives. As Paul says here, they profess to know God. He's talking about the false teachers. They profess to know God, but by their works, their deeds, they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and unfit for any good work. You see, this is why truth matters, and why a clear understanding and teaching of the gospel is so important. You know, I've heard people say, you are what you eat. I say, you are what you believe. You are what you believe. You are the value and beliefs you hold. And that's going to come out for all to see. You see, an elder's role, therefore, is to hold fast the faithful word in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able to exhort in sound doctrine and to reprove those who contradict. Amen.